Marissa was 23 when she matched with a girl named Emily on a dating app. Emily's profile wasn't like the others she'd seen. Her photos had a vintage vibe: long, dark hair, piercing blue eyes, and a cryptic bio that read, "Looking for someone who truly sees me." Marissa wasn't actively looking for anything serious, but something about Emily intrigued her. They started chatting, and the conversation flowed effortlessly. Emily was funny, clever, and seemed genuinely interested in Marissa's life. She mentioned growing up on Birch Street, a quiet neighborhood Marissa knew well, but something about it didn't sit right. That street had been mostly abandoned for years, ever since a tragic fire decades ago. When Marissa brought this up, Emily brushed it off and quickly changed the subject. Still, their connection was undeniable, and after a few days of texting, Emily suggested they meet. She invited Marissa to her house, a cozy old place near the cemetery, she said. There was just one odd thing. Emily never gave an exact address. Instead, she promised to guide Marissa over the phone when she got close. It seemed a little strange, but Marissa shrugged it off, figuring maybe Emily was just being cautious. After all, first dates with strangers could be risky. That night, Marissa decided to take a walk past Birch Street to scope things out before making any decisions. As she neared the end of the block, her steps slowed. The street was eerily quiet, lit only by a faint streetlight flickering in the distance. Most houses were dark, windows boarded up, yards overgrown. But there was one house that caught her eye, a small, crumbling two-story with peeling paint and broken shutters. The place looked deserted, except for a faint candlelight flickering in the upstairs window. Marissa's phone buzzed in her pocket, a text from Emily. "Are you close?" She stared at the house for a long moment, her gut twisting with unease. Something about this didn't feel right. Marissa kept walking, but her steps slowed even more as she passed the house. She glanced toward the flickering light in the upstairs window. It was the only sign of life on the street. No cars in the driveway, no porch light on. The front yard was overgrown with weeds, and the house itself looked like it had been abandoned for years. Something about it felt wrong. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her from behind those cracked windows. Her phone buzzed again. "I'm almost ready. Just let me know when you're on my block." That text made her stop in her tracks. Why wasn't Emily already waiting for her outside? Why did she seem so vague about everything? And why did she need to be told that Marissa was there, as if she wasn't in the house at all? Marissa quickly typed out a reply. "I'm here." "Which house is yours?" A long pause. No reply. She stood there, feeling the chilly night air wrap around her like a warning. Then, in the corner of her eye, she saw movement. Her heart jumped. A shadow flickered across the upstairs window, where the candlelight was burning, but it disappeared just as quickly as it had appeared. She took a step back. Her gut was screaming at her now. Something wasn't right. Then finally, her phone buzzed again. The message read, "Oh, you're early. I wasn't expecting you yet. Walk slow." Marissa's hands started to tremble. That was it. She was done. She turned on her heel and began walking back the way she'd come, but this time her pace quickened. As she walked, she kept glancing over her shoulder. The house stood still, dark and silent again. But she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her leave. Her phone buzzed one more time. She hesitated before looking. The message was short. "I see you." Marissa's heart pounded as she hurried down the street, clutching her phone tightly. Her instincts screamed at her to go home, but she couldn't stop glancing over her shoulder. The house loomed in the distance, growing smaller with each step she took. Her mind raced. Was this some kind of sick prank? Or was she walking right into something far more sinister? Her thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of a car engine. She froze in place, her eyes darting toward the intersection behind her. A white van with no headlights turned slowly onto the street. The van rolled forward at a creeping pace, its tires crunching softly against the pavement. Marissa's stomach twisted. The van didn't belong to any of the houses on this block. She knew that for sure. It wasn't just passing through either. It was moving too slowly, as if the driver was looking for something. Or someone. Her. Without thinking, Marissa darted behind a row of bushes lining a nearby house. She crouched low, peeking out through the leaves. The van stopped a few houses away from the one Emily had claimed to live in. The engine cut off, but nobody got out. The van just sat there, silent, waiting. Marissa bit her lip to keep from gasping. Her phone buzzed again in her hand, the screen lighting up in the dark. It was another message from Emily. "Okay, I'm ready. Let me know when you're on my block and I'll come out to meet you." Marissa's hands shook as she typed a response. "Who's in the van?" She hit send. No reply. Seconds ticked by like hours. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Then she heard it. The van's engine revved back to life. The headlights stayed off, but the van began creeping forward again, this time in her direction. Panic surged through Marissa's body. She didn't wait for another text. She sprang to her feet and bolted down the sidewalk, sticking close to the houses and staying out of the streetlights. Her footsteps were quiet but quick, her breathing shallow and ragged. She could hear the van behind her, its engine humming softly in the night. It was following her. There was no doubt now. She needed to get home. Fast. As she ran, she kept her phone clutched tightly in her hand, her thumb hovering over the call button. But who would she call? The police? Her mother? Would anyone even believe her? The van wasn't speeding or swerving. It wasn't making any obvious moves to chase her, but it didn't have to. It just kept creeping along behind her like a predator stalking its prey. Marissa took a sharp turn at the next corner, ducking into a side alley that cut through to the next block. She leaned against a wall, trying to catch her breath. Her hands shook as she stared at her phone, waiting, hoping that she'd lost them. But then, from the alley's entrance, she saw the van glide past, slow and steady. The driver never even glanced her way. Whoever they were, they knew exactly where she was. They didn't need to look. Marissa's mind was racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being hunted. Her instincts told her to run, but something deeper, a gnawing fear in her gut, told her to stay hidden. She peeked out from the alley, watching as the white van slowly disappeared down the street, its taillights still off. For a brief moment, she thought it might be over. Maybe they hadn't seen her turn into the alley. Maybe they had given up. Her heart began to slow as she took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She typed out a quick message on her phone to Emily. "This is really creepy. I'm not coming." Her finger hovered over the send button for a moment before she hit it. Seconds later, her phone buzzed with a reply. "I thought we were having fun." Marissa's blood ran cold. Her hands shook as she stared at the message, rereading it over and over. The van wasn't just a coincidence. Someone was playing a game with her. Then, another text. "You're so close. Don't stop now." Marissa's legs felt frozen in place, but her mind screamed at her to move. She needed to get home. She needed to get away. She turned back toward the alley entrance, taking slow, careful steps toward the street. Her plan was simple: stick to the shadows and avoid the main roads. But just as she reached the edge of the alley, her phone buzzed again. This time, the message wasn't from Emily. It was an unknown number. It simply read, "I see you." Her heart stopped. She glanced up from her phone, scanning the street for any movement. The van was gone, but the eerie silence of the neighborhood weighed heavily on her. Every house was dark. Every window was closed. It was like the entire block had been abandoned, except for her. Marissa started walking again, faster now, sticking close to the houses and keeping out of the streetlights. Her shoes barely made a sound against the pavement. She kept checking over her shoulder, her paranoia growing with every step. Suddenly, from behind her, she heard the faint crunch of footsteps on gravel. She stopped dead in her tracks. The footsteps stopped too. Her breath caught in her throat. She took another step forward. The footsteps followed. Marissa's chest tightened as panic gripped her. She turned around slowly, scanning the darkness behind her. The street was empty. The van was nowhere in sight. But the footsteps, they were real. She wasn't imagining it. Someone was there. Her phone buzzed again. She glanced down. Another text from the unknown number. "Turn around." Marissa's blood turned to ice. Her fingers trembled as she slowly raised her head, eyes darting back to the street. Standing at the end of the block, just barely visible in the shadows, was a figure. A tall figure dressed in black, standing perfectly still, watching her. They didn't move, they didn't speak. They just stood there, unmoving like a statue. Marissa's mind screamed at her to run, but as she turned to bolt down the street, the figure took a step forward, then another. The chase was on. Marissa ran as fast as she could, her heart pounding in her chest. She sprinted past houses, ducking into side streets and alleys, desperate to lose whoever was following her. Her phone buzzed again and again in her hand, but she didn't dare stop to check the messages. She already knew what they would say. "I see you. Don't run. I'm right behind you." Her lungs burned as she pushed herself harder, adrenaline coursing through her veins. She didn't stop until she saw the familiar outline of her house in the distance. Relief washed over her as she reached her front steps and fumbled with her keys, hands shaking violently. She threw open the door, slammed it shut behind her, and locked it. Finally, she was home, safe, or so she thought. As she leaned against the door, trying to catch her breath, her phone buzzed one final time. Slowly, she lifted it, dreading what she would see. The message read, "You left too soon. I was just getting started." Marissa stared at the screen, horrified, as a notification popped up. It was a photo. She opened it with trembling hands. The image showed the front of her house, taken from the sidewalk. Her blood ran cold. The caption beneath the photo read, "See you next time." Marissa didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside made her jump. Her curtains were drawn, her doors locked, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, watching. She sat on the couch, clutching her phone, scrolling through Emily's profile again. Everything seemed normal at first glance. A smiling face, carefully curated photos, and a bio that now sent chills down her spine. Looking for someone who truly sees me. Something wasn't adding up. Emily had been vague about her address, quick to change subjects when Marissa brought up Birch Street, and now there were the texts, the van, and that chilling final message. Her gut told her there was more to the story. Determined to find answers, Marissa pulled out her laptop and began searching. She typed Birch Street incidents into the search bar, her fingers trembling. The results loaded, and one headline caught her attention immediately. "Tragedy on Birch Street. Local woman found dead in 1954. Marissa's heart sank. She clicked on the article. The faded photo of a young woman filled her screen. Long, dark hair, piercing blue eyes. It was Emily. The caption read, "Emily Parker, 23, found dead in her family home." Her breath hitched as she scanned the article. Emily had been living alone after her parents' death. Neighbors reported strange behavior from her in the weeks leading up to her death. She was often seen standing at her window, staring out at the street for hours. One night, she vanished without a trace. Her body was discovered days later in the attic, clutching a broken locket in her hand. Cause of death? Unknown. Marissa sat frozen, staring at the screen. It didn't make sense. She had been texting Emily, talking to her, even planning to meet her. How could Emily be dead? Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. Another message from the unknown number. She hesitated before opening it. "You're so much like me." Her hands shook as the next message came through, accompanied by a photo. This time, it wasn't her house. It was the same article she had just found, the image of Emily Parker staring back at her. Below the photo, the text read, "We're not so different, Marissa." Panic surged through her. She jumped up from the couch, locking every door and window in the house. Her mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. How was someone sending her these messages? Was it a cruel prank? Or was it something worse? Another buzz. This time, the message was a voice memo. Marissa stared at it, dread pooling in her stomach. She pressed play. The voice on the recording was faint and distorted, like it was coming from an old cassette tape. But she recognized it immediately. It was Emily. "I've been waiting for someone to see me, for someone to really see me." The voice was soft, almost pleading, but then it grew colder, more sinister. "Now you've seen me, Marissa, and I'm not going anywhere." Marissa dropped the phone, backing away from it like it might come to life. Her mind reeled. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. But as she stood there, paralyzed with fear, she heard it, a faint tapping on the window behind her. Her blood turned to ice. Slowly, she turned around. The curtains were drawn, but the silhouette of a figure was visible through the thin fabric. Tall, motionless, watching. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. Her phone buzzed again on the floor. Another message. "Let me in." Marissa screamed, stumbling backward, knocking over a lamp as she grabbed her phone and ran for the bedroom. She slammed the door shut, locking it behind her. Her breathing was ragged, tears streaming down her face. The tapping had stopped, but now there was another sound. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving toward the front door. Her phone buzzed one final time. She didn't want to look, but she couldn't stop herself. The message read, "You're not the first, and you won't be the last." Marissa sat trembling on the floor, clutching her phone as the footsteps outside grew louder. Whoever, or whatever, Emily was, she had found her, and she wasn't going to let her go. Marissa sat on her bedroom floor, her back pressed against the door, her phone clutched tightly in her hands. Her chest heaved with shallow breaths, tears streaming down her cheeks as she stared at the last message. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last." The words echoed in her mind, each one a dagger of dread. The footsteps outside her house continued, slow and methodical, circling the property. Marissa held her breath, listening intently. Whoever was out there wasn't in a hurry. They were taking their time. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. Silence. Marissa's phone buzzed again. This time, the message wasn't text. It was another photo. Her shaking fingers hovered over the screen before opening it. It was a picture of her bedroom window, taken from outside. Marissa's heart nearly stopped. She slowly turned her head toward the window. The curtains were still drawn, but the faint glow of the streetlight outside cast a shadow through the fabric. A shadow that hadn't been there before. Someone was standing outside the window. Her phone buzzed again, another message from the unknown number. "I'm right here." Marissa bit her lip to keep from screaming. She couldn't think straight. Her mind raced with questions. Who was this? How did they know her? And why did they keep referencing Emily? Her gaze flicked to her laptop, still open on her bed. The article about Emily Parker remained on the screen. There was something about it that gnawed at her. Something she hadn't noticed before. She crawled toward the bed, never taking her eyes off the window, and scanned the article again. There, a single line buried toward the end of the piece. Neighbors claimed to see Emily Parker walking through town weeks after her death, always near the house on Birch Street. They called her the lost girl. Marissa's stomach twisted in knots. This wasn't just a ghost story. There were real sightings, real encounters. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her focus back. The message was another photo. This time, it was a close-up of her front door. The caption read, "Let me in, Marissa. I want to talk." Marissa scrambled to her feet, rushing to her dresser and grabbing a pair of scissors. Her hands shook as she gripped them tightly. Her heart raced, her mind screaming at her to call the police. But something inside her knew it wouldn't matter. Whoever was outside wasn't someone the police could help with. The sound of footsteps began again, this time approaching the front door. Tap, tap, tap. A knock echoed through the house. Slow, measured, Marissa's phone buzzed one more time. Her eyes darted to the screen. "Why are you hiding? I thought you wanted to see me." She pressed her back against the bedroom door, scissors trembling in her hands. The knocking continued, louder now, more insistent. Suddenly, the knocking stopped. Silence once again filled the house. Then, the voice came. Software whispering, coming from just outside her bedroom door. "You can't hide forever, Marissa. I've waited too long." Marissa's blood ran cold. She gripped the scissors tighter, her knuckles turning white. The voice was familiar. It was Emily's. But it wasn't coming from her phone. It was coming from inside the house. Her breathing quickened, and tears blurred her vision. The voice spoke again, this time more clearly. "Let me in." Marissa's phone slipped from her hand and hit the floor with a dull thud. She knew what she had to do. Slowly, she reached down, picked up the phone, and dialed 911. The line rang once, twice. Then, it went dead. A chill ran down her spine as she realized her phone wasn't working anymore. The voice outside her door grew louder, more persistent. "Let me in, Marissa. You're not the first, and you won't be the last." With a sudden burst of desperation, Marissa flung open her window, climbing out onto the roof. The cold night air hit her face as she struggled to keep her balance. She looked down at the street below. Empty, silent. But just as she thought she was safe, she heard the front door creak open. Slow, deliberate. Someone was inside. Marissa didn't wait to see who it was. She climbed down from the roof, landing hard on the ground, and ran. She didn't look back. She didn't stop until she reached the end of the block, panting and gasping for air. Her phone buzzed one last time. Trembling, she looked at the screen. The message read, "I'll find you." And beneath it, a photo of her, taken from behind. Marissa turned around, her heart pounding in her chest. But the street was empty. For now. Marissa stumbled through the empty streets, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she glanced over her shoulder, expecting to see someone, or something, following her. But the street remained empty, shrouded in shadows. Her phone buzzed again. She didn't want to look, but her curiosity and fear pulled her in. It was another text from the unknown number. "You can run, but you can't leave me behind." Marissa's chest tightened. Her mind raced with questions. Who was this person? What did they want? And how did they know so much about her? She needed answers. She needed to know who or what Emily really was. She turned a corner and saw the dim lights of a police station up ahead. Relief flooded through her. She ran toward it, pushing open the heavy glass door and stumbling inside. The officer at the front desk looked up, startled by her disheveled appearance. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Marissa nodded, breathless. I need to report something. Someone's been following me." The officer gestured for her to sit down. "Take a deep breath. Start from the beginning." Marissa took a shaky breath and began recounting the events of the night. The Tinder match, the strange messages, the white van, the figure outside her window. The officer listened quietly, his expression growing more concerned with each detail. When she mentioned the name Emily Parker, the officer's demeanor changed. He straightened in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "What did you say her name was?" "Emily Parker. She said she lived on Birch Street." The officer exchanged a glance with another officer standing nearby. "Birch Street? That house has been abandoned for decades. No one's lived there since the Parker family tragedy." Marissa's heart pounded in her chest. "I know, I found the article, but I've been talking to her. She's been texting me all night." She held out her phone, showing the officer the string of messages. The officer frowned as he took the phone, scrolling through the texts. "These messages, they aren't coming from a registered number. They don't trace back to any phone." Marissa stared at him in disbelief. "That's impossible. Someone sent them." The officer handed the phone back to her. "Look, we've had reports about that house for years. Strange noises, sightings. People claim to see a woman standing in the window. But every time we check it out, there's no one there. It's just an empty house." Marissa's hands trembled as she clutched her phone. "So, what are you saying? That I've been talking to a ghost?" The officer didn't answer right away. "I don't know what you've been talking to, but if I were you, I'd stay far away from that house." Marissa's phone buzzed again. She glanced down, dread pooling in her stomach. It was a photo of her, sitting inside the police station. Her blood ran cold. The caption read, "They can't help you, Marissa. You're mine." Marissa shot to her feet, panic setting in. "They're outside. They're here." The officer rushed to the window, peering out into the dark parking lot. It was empty. "There's no one out there." Marissa shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "They're here. I know they are." The lights in the station flickered. The air grew colder, and a strange hum filled the room. Suddenly, the front door creaked open. The officers drew their weapons, aiming at the entrance. "Who's there? Show yourself!" But no one entered. The door swung open wider, revealing the empty street beyond. The cold wind howled through the station, sending papers flying off desks. Marissa's phone buzzed one final time. She stared at the screen, her hands shaking. The message read, "I'm inside." Marissa's breath caught in her throat as she looked up. In the reflection of the station's window, she saw her own terrified face, and standing directly behind her, a woman with long dark hair and piercing blue eyes. Emily, smiling. The lights flickered once more, and the station was plunged into darkness. The lights in the station flickered back on, but Marissa was gone. The officers stood frozen, their eyes scanning the empty lobby. The front door was still open, swaying slightly in the cold night breeze. Where the hell did she go? The second officer slowly lowered his gun, his face pale. "She was right here. You saw her, right?" They both nodded, exchanging uneasy glances. But there was no sign of Marissa. No sound of footsteps, no open windows or back doors. The only thing left was her phone, lying face down on the floor. The first officer cautiously approached it, his hand trembling as he reached down and picked it up. The screen was still on, displaying the last message. "I'm inside." The officer flipped through the phone, scrolling back through the conversation history. His expression twisted into one of horror. "Look at this." He turned the phone toward his partner. Every text Marissa had received from Emily was gone. Erased. In their place was a new message. "You can't save her, she's mine now." Inside the abandoned house on Birch Street, a faint glow flickered from an upstairs window. The same candlelight Marissa had seen the night of her date. In the attic, dust and cobwebs clung to the walls. Polaroid photos lined the edges of the room, pinned to the rotting wooden beams. Each photo showed a different woman, but one photo stood out. It was Marissa, her face frozen in a wide-eyed expression of terror, her mouth slightly open as if she'd been screaming. The sound of footsteps echoed through the attic, slow, measured, deliberate. A voice whispered, "Welcome home, Marissa."